This is the Venezuelan embassy in London, and every day the news from that country seems to get worse. In March, the Supreme Court dissolved the National Assembly. The partial reversal of this decision did not prevent the outbreak of a new wave of deadly violence. The death toll is 30 and rising. Both opposition and government supporters have been killed. Government offices have been looted and burned, and government officials murdered. And there's no end in sight. In the chaos, the opposition seems ready to sacrifice economic recovery to remove President Maduro from office, with reports that the National Assembly head, Julio Borges, recently contacted over a dozen leading international banks, urging them not to do business with Venezuela. The government in turn faces increasing criticism for its inability to solve or even admit the full severity of the crisis, or what some have called a slide into authoritarianism. Others claim the elected government is being attacked by a violent opposition elite supported by the US empire, determined to secure regime change. President Maduro was democratically chosen in an electoral system which former US President Jimmy Carter has called the best in the world. Yet the current protests have caused chaos, scores of deaths and waves of violence, and more recently the destruction of schools, courts, and Air Force Base was even attacked, while public transport, health and veterinary facilities have been ruined, with still more fatalities. How have the problems in Venezuela been reported? And has America been involved in the current crisis there? Simple questions with important answers, especially for the people of Venezuela. Let's start with this. Why is Venezuela suffering such a serious economic crisis at this time? We put that to the public. Here's what they said.
Well, the bottom line is oil. We are now the world's leading oil power, and the empire wants to come and take all of our resources from us, and we must prevent it anyway.
There are two very important reasons. The first is not a lie that there is an economic crisis, but with the greatest amount of secret intelligence and sabotage work against our people. And the second reason is that they know they can attack us. But this town is so noble that it knows that we are going to struggle. We are going to go hungry, or we will continue going hungry, but we are not going to bend our knee. Venezuela is going to prove to the world that sovereignty is sacred, and the sovereignty of the people is immense. There is nothing that will make us give up.
The crisis is due to the unconventional war that we are living in. With this opposition, who are from the right, and they have no compassion, they have no feelings, and they do not care about the humanitarian aspects of the situation. They are looking for ways to interfere. Among them is that guy, Don Almagro.
The economic crisis we have in our country, Venezuela, is generated due to the xenophobia and corruption of the wicked oligarchy in the opposition. That oligarchy is the one that generates all the crises that there are here. There is no food, there is much unemployment, because they want power. They want to be the power in our country, Venezuela.
Well, my understanding is three main reasons. First and foremost, the low oil prices that have been low for some years now have been really devastating for not just Venezuela, but many economies that are particularly dependent on oil exports. So this is one of the main factors. And like I said, this has damaged the economies of not just Venezuela, but Iran and Russia and even other oil exporting countries as well. So this is a key part, and Venezuela unfortunately has not fully diversified its industry. It's very dependent on oil exports, still very dependent on oil exports to a single market, that's the US. So when the oil price collapses, this really causes real economic mayhem and problems in the budgeting and so on. Secondly, there's a political element, without a shadow of a doubt. The opposition, who are supported by big business and so on, those big businesses have taken the opportunity to really put the boot in as the low oil prices are biting, and they've actually have been hoarding, speculating and hoarding goods that's been triggering inflation, very high levels of inflation, which is not only attributable to oil prices, but this deliberate political strategy of opposition supporting businessmen deliberately withholding goods from the market in order to basically create unrest against the government. And that links to the third reason, which is the general political instability in the country, which is absolutely being organized by the opposition parties. And of course, political instability always is a deterrent to investment and creates economic problems and so on. But again, this is a deliberate strategy of the opposition to create economic chaos, worsen the economic conditions in order to provoke unrest against the government.
I think there is undeniably a very severe economic crisis in Venezuela. There are economic components to that crisis, but there are also crucially political components to that crisis. Perhaps one of the manifestations of that crisis is the shortage of basic goods in Venezuela today. Speaking to family and to contacts in the country, I've been told that up until recently, before the violent protests began, that the situation had been much better in 2017 than it was last year, when it was even worse than it is now. Why has that happened? Now, I think the government has to respond, has to take a level of criticism. The economic policies of the Venezuelan government are not happening in a vacuum. They're taking place in a context of acute political polarization. And crucially, and I think this is what is omitted by the foreign reporting on Venezuela, is that the significant elements, I would say, within the Venezuelan opposition, radical elements, basically are intent on a policy of regime change for the government. So that includes violent actions in the street. And so this political context is crucial to understanding the economic outcomes, I guess, of some of the failings and the challenges that the economy faces today.
Could it be that the US has contributed to the Venezuelan crisis? Here's what the public thought.
Of course, their hands are stuck as usual, as a terrible empire that has done much harm to the people of the world and even more harm to the indigenous peoples. But our people will not crawl or submit, and they know it. And that is why they have done what they have done. They have sought all forms of war to harm us. We are worthy. We are the children of Chavez. We are the children of Bolivar. We are fighting them, and well, we go ahead with all the difficulties that we know we have. But we will face them. But it must be won by the organization of the people.
Yes, totally. Totally criminal against this homeland. I have not the slightest doubt.
It is quite clear that they pay with some good dollars that they have there in their country to generate more chaos. They keep food, the money and the bread all there in the United States. And the medicines? For what? To say then that you do not vote for Maduro. He does not work. You have to get him out of this country.
We have seen how it invaded the oil countries, especially those of OPEP. There have been invasions in Syria, now in Iraq, in the other country that was from Gaddafi. Imagine it.
Obviously, I believe the US is behind it, because it is the great capitalist that pursues riches in all parts of the world. So what interests them is where there is riches and how to get it. What can also sustain them, what materials they need, and their economic interests.
Absolutely, the US has been working hand in glove with the opposition since the day not just Maduro but Chavez got elected. And your viewers will remember the 2002 attempted coup against Chavez, which was the US revealed their hand really in that. Immediately after the coup regime got underway, the US immediately went to recognize the new coup leadership as the legitimate government, called for, propagated all of the lies being put forward by the coup leaders that Chavez had resigned and so on. And even once Chavez was restored to power, the US almost seemed to be failing to recognize that and called on Chavez effectively to stand down and he should recognize that this shows that there's unhappiness, rather than congratulating the democratic leader for having seen off this attempted military coup. They were somehow blaming it on him and increasing the pressure on him nonetheless. So they revealed their hand there. That was clearly an attempted coup that was jointly orchestrated by the opposition in Washington, and the unrest we're seeing now, absolutely the same scenario. The opposition are working hand in glove, as I say, with Washington to provoke unrest. The opposition have been supporting a violent violent attacks on the government, not just government officials and but government supporters, big campaign of even murders and arson. So this is all being egged on by Washington and other Western countries.
I think the US clearly wants the Chavez government and now the Maduro government to leave the presidency. Venezuela perhaps will not be forgiven for spearheading resistance to the neoliberal policies that the US has traditionally put forward in Latin America. Chavez famously led an axis that resulted in the overturning of a proposed free trade agreement in 2005. And so the US is pursuing a policy of regime change, and now with Trump in power, very bellicose rhetoric and actions and erratic behavior, he's certainly heightened even further the attempts to remove the Venezuelan government from power. Just last week, he pursued a joint statement with the Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos, saying that they would do what was necessary to deal with the Venezuelan issue, or something to that effect. And it's interesting that he's partnered up with the Colombian government to try and castigate Venezuela. If we recall, the US government has been a key ally of the Colombian government for many years during the Uribe years and much before that. And this is the Colombian government is a government that has been that's overseen the mass murder of civilians by the security forces, which are sponsored to the tune of billions by the US government. So it's very difficult for people in Latin America and elsewhere to accept that the US and Colombia have any moral authority to be judging what Venezuela should be doing with regards to human rights today or at any point, really.
What are the public's comments on how the media has reported the crisis in Venezuela?
What the media say all the time is pure lies. They say that we are here killing each other. They write down headlines with pa pa pa, 30 dead, 60 wounded. That's a lie. Look how it is. I see people walk, go to the markets, buy their food. Here there is a good life. All they do is lie and pervert the truth, and this is all done in the East, so that the people give up.
Many times the media have blocked and distorted the truth. And well, there are many channels that deprive us of the truth and do not allow the people to express what is really happening.
Totally. The media in this country want to orchestrate a coup. They've wanted a coup since President Chavez was in government, and they still want it now. They have been deceiving the people through the media and through social media communication. They unfortunately have many means to cause chaos. These people are linked to the opposition and the United States government, and they want to overthrow the Venezuelan revolution.
The approach is like tabloid trash. They are clearly all on the side of the right wing, and the opposition never tell the truth.
Well, there is truthful information and others that are not truthful. There are some partisans and others who are not partisans. That's the situation. And then they distort the mind of what we know with falsehoods about what is happening in the country.
There's clearly a propaganda war against the Venezuelan government right now. That's what we're seeing. And if you read articles on all the mainstream press, I know there's actually there's been demonstrations in London against the Guardian's reporting of the issue. But this is across the mainstream media. The Financial Times, for example, reported that Maduro's popular support is on 7%, when actually the most recent elections his support has got 40%. So there's a whole array of misinformation being put out in the mainstream media about what's happening. They systematically ignore the fact, the role of low oil prices in causing this. Everything, all the problems are attributed to just the Venezuelan government, its mismanagement and so on, ignoring all of those other factors, ignoring the opposition's campaign of violence and murder. Last year there was a congresswoman and her 2 children executed. This is a huge and violent movement that's going on. All of that is basically suppressed in the mainstream Western media, and it's very irresponsible, because actually what they're doing, they're helping to promote the idea. In fact, some of them openly call for that there should be a coup against the government, and it's very irresponsible, because as the opposition in Venezuela, if they feel the West is on their side because of what Western media is saying, then that eggs them on to do any more, any number of more violent acts and even another attempted coup and so on and so forth. So it gives the impression to the opposition that no measures, whatever measures they take against the government, there's nothing they can do that won't be basically celebrated by the West. There's no measure, however violent, that's going to be condemned by the West, and that eggs them on to actually step up their campaign of arson and murder and so on. So it's a very irresponsible game the Western media is playing, and it's systematic misreporting of the situation in Venezuela.
I think the corporate and Western government-supported media or mainstream media has failed in its reporting of the Venezuelan crisis. It has very much taken on the narrative of the opposition, which paints the protesters as peaceful, pro-democracy protesters, and minimized or even just excluded the very violent actions being enacted in Venezuela today by these protesters. There was a maternity hospital that had to be evacuated after 2 days that it was attacked. The media have no interest really in discussing these elements, in really promoting the violent actions of the Venezuelan opposition. There's a narrative that's clearly being put forward of a repressive Venezuelan government and peaceful protesters looking for democracy, essentially. And this is across the board, unfortunately, and you see it from the so-called liberal or left-wing mainstream media outlets to the right. So I think for this crisis, they've certainly failed, and I would argue that reporting on Venezuela now has been skewed and biased towards opposition narratives pretty much for a good 10 years or more.
Venezuela has been described as authoritarian, but the statistics tell a different story. Hugo Chavez was elected president 4 times in 14 years, from 1999 to 2013, one of the longest terms for any president in any nation. Chavez secured poll ratings ranging from 55% to his opponent's 44% in 2012, up to a margin of 63% to 37% in 2006. In every election, his majority exceeded the winning margin of the current American President Trump, who failed to secure a majority of the popular vote, gaining just 46% to Clinton's 48%. How does the public picture the crisis in Venezuela ending? Here's what they told us.
In peace, as always. Here we want peace.
This crisis will end with the Constitution, and Maduro will be victorious, because we feel truly revolutionary and truly know that this is negative and will fight, because the Constitution is what is going to take us to victory. What is the people commanding, ruling along the Nicolás Maduro? Because there is the Constitution, which allows him to lead until 2019.
The way to finish is with the Constitution, in accordance with the Articles 346, 348, 349 of the Charter, is to subsume all that has been achieved with respect of these 18 years of revolution. Adapting it to the Bolivarian Magna Carta is the only way to create dialogue and seek the peace in society.
I think it would be very good and cheerful, because the call to the Constitution is an internal mobilization of all citizens, so they can express themselves and say what is needed, and that the Constitution will be reinforced with what the people want and will benefit the village assembly.
Well, unfortunately, I think there are 2 main possible scenarios. There's the possible scenario that the West and its opposition allies in Venezuela are hoping for, which I think is like a kind of small-scale version of what happened in Libya in 2011, which is to encourage violent protests, and then as soon as there's any kind of crackdown, if a crackdown is provoked, then to portray that as some kind of massacre and atrocities by the government, which will be used as a pretext for intervention. Now the US is prodding the Organization of American States, the other Latin American countries, to do a regional military intervention. Some of its client states like Colombia and so on should take the lead in some kind of military intervention against Venezuela. So that's one scenario, is increased violent unrest, provoking a state crackdown, triggering or providing the pretext for military intervention. The other scenario is, of course, that actually the Venezuelan government are able to get a handle on all of this and adopt a zero-tolerance approach to violent protests and arson and so on, and actually manage to keep a lid on all of that and not allow, manage to nip this thing in the bud and not allow it to come to blows and so on. So that's the other main alternative scenario, I think.
The crisis in Venezuela is very hard to predict where it will end. Sadly, the opposition appear to be intent on regime change, and this is resulting in deaths. The government security services have also perpetrated some of the death, but these people have been put into prison. So 54 deaths up to this point. I would hope that the calls for peaceful resolutions by the Pope, by other former Latin American presidents such as Mujica of Uruguay, would fall on the ears of the opposition. The government has shown a willingness to engage in dialogue. I think, unfortunately, the radical elements of the opposition have taken the lead in terms of the opposition strategy. And at the moment, it very much appears that they will not be happy until some sort of intervention is enacted. And this is where the danger of Trump's recent statements come in, likening the Venezuelan situation to Syria. It's very worrying that attempts at peaceful resolution are being sidelined and the voices of war are being promoted and coming to the fore in Venezuela.
There has been a lot of violence on the streets of Venezuela. Who's causing it? Do the public have a view?
The internal oligarchy, along with the guidelines that give them the empire, among them are causing this. Because they are the ones who manage the means of production here and are obviously linked with them.
Those are the ones who are looking because they do not want to see anything positive on Maduro. And Maduro is the one who rules here with the people and for the people.
The right-wing opposition is part of the plot and the unconventional war.
While citizens, I'm going to say oppositions, they're the ones who make the situation violent because they want to access power through violence. There is a set of names that we all know. I'm not going to say it, but we all know.
Well, without a doubt, like I say, this is a campaign of violence orchestrated by the Venezuelan opposition. Of course, there are young people in particular who are frustrated with the situation. There genuinely are very real economic problems in Venezuela, food shortages and unemployment and so on. But what the opposition is doing is systematically and deliberately funneling this anger into, as I say, a campaign of violence designed to provoke a state crackdown. So really this is what's behind the violence.
In a nutshell, what's driving the violence in Venezuela are the opposition's attempts to violently overthrow the government. The Venezuelan, and when I say the Venezuelan opposition, I'm saying political leaders, high-ranking political leaders in the Venezuelan opposition have systematically expressed the fact that they do not recognize the current Venezuelan government, democratic mandate. And they are mobilizing, they are asking their supporters to go into the streets to demand change and to demand elections when there aren't any scheduled until at the moment. So I think the driver is the opposition's attempts at regime change, and the government. It's lamentable that there are security service personnel which have killed protesters. It is good that these people have been immediately jailed, something that actually would never happen in Britain, where police officers have killed protesters, that you rarely get any indictments. But I think what's at the core of it, the essence is the attempts at regime change. And I think this is something which is never really reported fairly in the mainstream media, that the opposition basically have a policy of regime change at the moment.
In more recent right-wing violence, women, children and over 50 newborn babies had to be evacuated by the government from a public maternity hospital which had come under attack from opposition gangs. Elsewhere, a nurse on her way to work was fatally injured by a bottle presumed to have been thrown by an opposition sympathiser at a pro-government march. The United States doesn't claim to be engaged in regime change in Venezuela. However, many believe the downward spiral of violence will continue, and they do point the finger of blame at Washington. If the United States is shown to be involved, it will once again have blood on its hands, this time in South America.